Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast. I'm Neil Lawson, your host and director of Compass. Joining me to help manage the questions is Grace Barnett from the Compass office. Hello, Grace. You okay today?
Hello, yeah, I'm okay.
Good. Look, these are unprecedented times and we need to rise to the new and economic challenges we now face. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking to writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists and public service workers about how we come out of this in much better shape than we went in, a good society after COVID-19. These conversations have live access for our members who can put questions directly to our guests. If you want to participate in a live call, go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass today. Otherwise, sit back and relax and enjoy this podcast. The virus impacts on everyone, but it impacts on them differently. Joining us this week to discuss what the crisis is revealing is John Harris, the Guardian columnist and long-term video reporter through the Anywhere But Westminster series with his collaborator, John Demokos. John, originally from the outskirts of Manchester, I don't know why I say that, has spent his life as a journalist making the steady transition from music and culture to politics and social observation. He's been described as the Hogarth of our times, and I think that's quite an accolade, and I think it's probably quite accurate as well. The format will be that I'll ask John a few questions and then open it up to Compass members on the call for questions and comments before we finish, absolutely no later than 7 o'clock. Please keep your questions or comments brief so that we can get as many in as possible. And as Zoom etiquette demands, please keep yourself on mute unless you're invited to speak. And please post your questions in the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of the bar of the screen to the right of the mute button. The hashtag for the conversation is #It'sComplicated. What a surprise. And finally, please note this conversation is being recorded and will go out as a podcast. Okay, so there's the rules and the procedures. Tonight, we've got John Harris. John, tell us where you are and how you are.
I'm at home, like those of us fortunate enough to be at home. I'm in Frome in Somerset, where I've lived since 2009, and where I am working, doing, I would argue, I hope anyway, the same sort of journalism that we've been doing for 10 years, but we're doing it in a slightly different way, because obviously we're not allowed to venture out like everyone else. So we have to call in material from people and speak to people all over the country about their experiences using platforms like this.
So normally you just sort of wander up to people in the street, don't you? You spy them. But so now you're responding to the people who are asking to be spoken to. Is it very different?
It's a little bit different in the sense that element of chance, which we really like, is not nearly as pronounced. I mean, we found out what we were doing and how and why we were doing it by just doing it. I mean, that's what happened. So there was no plan for the way that those films were made. But eventually we realized that although the vox pop is very often done badly, these very sort of short encounters with people that don't mean anything, if you do them well, they can be very productive. But the one great virtue of them is they're the most instant way of breaking out of filter bubbles. If you just say, oh, they look interesting over there, I wonder what they think. Or someone says, well, what are you doing? And we go, we're making a film. Then straight away you're out of your Twitter followers and people who share your assumptions necessarily and all that. So it's a little bit different now. But having said that, you cast the net wide enough and, we're dealing with people on the ground, sort of organizations, but very often sort of hyper-local organizations. So actually the range of people that we meet doesn't feel that much more narrow than it ever is. I mean, I've had a long conversation with a fellow in Alum Rock in Birmingham today, who's lost 11 of his relatives to COVID-19. He's organizing community help out of his mosque and was talking very movingly about that. Yesterday, I had a conversation with a fellow in Leeds whose mum's recently died in a care home. I've spoken to a young guy, 25, who's got arthritis, who has immunosuppressive medication and is there for what they call shielding in a basement flat in South London. A tremendous range of people. So it doesn't feel like doing it in this way compromises what we do. It's just different.
And are people opening up more as a consequence of this? Do you think?
I was having this conversation earlier on today with some journalism students, again on Zoom. And I said, they were talking to me about how willing people are to talk at the moment. And it seems to me that people want to talk, A, because they're not getting as much engagement as they ordinarily would in the average day, right? So the prospect of having a sort of in-depth conversation with someone has an appeal that perhaps it didn't have 3 or 4 weeks ago. Also, I think there's a thing in the air at the minute about a lot of things being upturned, and the usual instinctive deference one has to authority and all that is much weaker. I suppose because authority is seen to have rather screwed this up so far. So I think in that sense, people are keen at a talk. I mean, I had a conversation with a district nurse the other day about what it's like being a district nurse. Now, ordinarily they'd say, "Oh, I can't talk. I work for the NHS," or whatever. That didn't happen because she feels she's got something to say about the fact that she and her colleagues haven't got PPE and all the things you'd expect. So I think people want to talk and they've got things to say.
Good. I've seen 2 films you've done so far on that Zoom style, and since the lockdown, one on jobs and one on kind of living from home. It's really early to sort of pull thoughts together about what all of this means, but certainly this is revealing stuff, isn't it? Crisis reveal things. What do you think is being revealed in terms of people's work and people's home lives?
I think there's a lot of things we knew already, but they've just become more vivid and they feel more urgent. In the conversations that I have with John and Leia and Bruno, the other 2 people who've sort of become part of the team, we've talked about this crisis really being like a great magnifier, but these things always are, right? So if you look at the history of pandemics, Spanish flu, I was reading about yellow fever in the American Deep South in the 19th century yesterday, and war, broadly speaking, works very often in the same way, particularly mass mobilization war. Is any sort of fragilities or vulnerabilities or weaknesses socially that a country or a society goes into a crisis with, inevitably they become much more visible. And there's a sense really, because crises necessarily involve some sort of exchange. I think, well, look, we're suffering here, and therefore, and I'm not knocking this. This is quite right. I think people therefore feel that we talk, haven't we, lately about reparations for young people. That's become part of the vernacular. That somehow, on account of people's huge suffering in the midst of all this, that as and when this begins to recede, some things need to be put right. Yeah. And that was the nature. That was the nature of 45. To some extent, although it didn't really materialize, there was a lot of talk around the First World War of that, right? And I think it's underrated in the case of the Spanish flu of 1918 that tilted things in all sorts of directions. I think it's widely accepted that was one of the catalysts over time for Indian independence. Totally regrettably and awfully, the Spanish flu was one of the catalysts in the absolute arrival of the apartheid system in South Africa. These things always have effects, don't they? And I think we have to be careful that we don't. It's right to talk about these things in terms of the fact that people will expect a greater measure of what used to be called social justice out of this, and that organizations like Compass have to be instrumental to really making that real and giving it a voice. But at the same time, there are all sorts of other things bound up in this moment which won't necessarily lead in a progressive direction at all, and worry me. It's not clear at all for sure which political direction this will lead us in. Like most things, it has aspects of everything. Liberalism, authoritarianism, right-wing politics, left-wing politics, all axes, it seems to me. There's possibilities on all ends of them bound up in this crisis.
So maybe you're beginning to tell us it's bloody complicated, which is taken as a given around Compass. We'll come back to some of the party stuff. But just, one of the things, we've been talking about and is kind of out there is this, the virus, the crisis affects everyone, but it, affects them differently. There is a kind of Guardian liberal, let's bake sourdough and learn German while we're locked down, compared to, my God, how am I going to feed the kids? There's only beans and the food banks, and the universal credit's not turned up, and whatever. I mean, while there has been a common experience, there's been a big divergence in how people have experienced this thing, isn't there? And we have to be careful about that.
Hugely. So there's all sorts of manifestations of that, right? There's what it's like living in a place or an area where this thing is really prevalent and it's taking lots of people's lives. This conversation I had today was with someone in Birmingham, where the awfulness of this and the catastrophe for those communities is very, very real. It's not that real where I am, thankfully, right? So the Southwest, for some reason, my own theory is it's to do with the fact we've got crap public transport here, right? It doesn't seem to be as affected so far. whereas where he was talking from was very affected. There was another catastrophe in the midst of his community, which is largely Muslim, as I understand it, in Alum Rock in Birmingham, which is that unlike secularized people like me, they move in a culture and a part of a culture where older people are venerated. Quite rightly, they're thought of as being elders, as repositories of wisdom. And those people, disproportionately, as we all know, are dying, right? So it's not only that they're people's friends and relatives; they have a place in the life of that community as pillars of that community, and that makes the hurt all the greater. Now, I hadn't really thought about that until I had that conversation. That's another way in which this falls in different ways for different people. I tend to bang on about social class and stuff, and as you just mentioned, there's a huge dimension to all this as regards social class, which is also about our sort of cultural expression of what it is to be in the midst of this crisis. And I am able to homeschool my daughter and make playlists and go on those Twitter listening parties every night, and those things are keeping me going, right? Not that I don't feel anxious about this. I feel extremely anxious about it, but that's a very narrow experience. And I suspect the single greatest share of people in various different ways are finding this really, really difficult emotionally, in terms of their mental health, but also economically. It's really, really difficult, and human beings come in all shapes and sizes. And for a lot of them, like making brownies and walking around the fields around your town is just like this impossibly idyllic prospect that they can't access. And that's easily forgotten. And it has got too much, that chocolate brownies, learn German, go and hula hoop in the garden. That view of it, I think, is got too much. I can't cope with it. It sticks in my core a little bit, like aspects of the Brexit debate, like people moaning about the fact that Slovakian nannies had to go home and all that. And those things might be very real and all that, but you have to be careful because not everybody's experience is like that.
When when you've been out on the road for anywhere but Westminster, you go to some tough places, but the call that you were doing with the single mum at home with their kind of ADHD kid,
yeah,
maybe what does that feel like when you're having to talk to those people? Because the kind of it made me cry listening to her. It must be really hard.
Yeah, it's really hard. It's really difficult. Because when I spoke to her name's Teresa, and she lives about 7 or 8 miles outside Newcastle, just inside Northumbria, and she has COPD, lung disease, and as a consequence of her physical ill health, she has some mental health problems, and her son Morgan is autistic. He is fixated, not unreasonably, on the idea that his mum might die or is likely to die as a result of all this, and can't sleep. And it's very difficult for the family to go out, if at all, to get shopping because they're terrified that they'll bring the virus into the house and all that stuff, right? And so when I was talking to her, and she spoke very bluntly and vividly about their predicament, but straight away, you feel, I don't know whether guilt's the right word, but you're aware of the contrast between your own life and the other person's life. You're very wary of seeming prurient, or that you're reading something into it which is sensationalistic, but that's offset by the fact that you feel that those people need a voice and their experiences need to be heard. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think we handled that case like we handle most cases, very sensitively. And it worked as a means of saying to people, look what's happening here, right? So as much as we all agree, or we should all agree, that the lockdown is necessary and inevitable, don't go on Twitter and say lockdown now like it's simple. And don't write articles saying this is difficult, but it's really straightforward, because it's not. It's impossible. It's verging on impossible for lots of people. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. It just means you have to be careful in your forcefulness and your certainties about it.
Yeah. Nuance is my favourite word. So if people want to start loading any questions up on the chat box, signal that you want to ask a question. Better still, signal what you want to ask John a question about. Grace will determine whether your question gets called, because she's the arbiter of these things. So you've been, I don't know, how long have you been doing Anywhere But Westminster? 10 years?
10 years.
10 years. So just bring out some of the kind of top line flavors of what you've learned and experienced in that time. And I guess, how does that relate to now? And what's the scale of the kind of feeling? And, is there just been a continuation of anxiety, of precariousness, of anger at the political system? Or is it taken off now?
Okay, so here's the boiled down version. It started really because the Guardian would send us to party conferences and to make films there. And we'd make these sort of knockabout, but, essentially with a serious point films about party conference. But this was about a year or 2 years after the crash of 2008, and we sensed, and we weren't alone in this, there was a growing gap between the sort of rituals of things like party conferences and life as it was being lived. And so we started to leave party conference, literally leave. So we're not doing this now. We're going out into the world to find out what people think. And it's quite good when you've got a party conference in a city or a town, because you can point at it and go, what do you think of that? And we got really good replies from people, and we began to realize that the emphasis of our journalism should completely shift towards going out into the world, really. And it sort of helped that I don't live in London. I haven't lived in London since 2004. I mean, not that I would have felt different if I lived in any number of places in London. Let's not kid ourselves. But it just meant that by not living in London, I wasn't able to go to Parliament. So that was just that whole world was just out of my sphere, you know. And we just coincidentally, well, maybe it's not a coincidence because it's all about the fallout from the crash, you know. By a year or two into it, we were documenting austerity. That's what we started doing. And then all these political changes started to happen. So then we started to chronicle the rise of UKIP, because that was another that came around the corner, 2010, 2011. That started to happen. Then Scottish independence began to gain momentum. We did lots of work around that between sort of 2012 and 2014. Then Labour lost the election in 2015. Then Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party. Now, all of these things were things that a lot of the media got wrong. Most of the media didn't see these things coming, let alone the referendum of 2016. Now, in each case, I wouldn't say that we'd stood there and predicted these things, but we had a keen sense that they weren't open and shut, right? When they were all saying, oh, we think Labour are in a good shout of winning the 2015 election, we said, well, we don't think they are, because we haven't heard anybody we met say that or reflect that. And equally, when everybody thought the Remain campaign was going to win the referendum, if you watch the film we made, there's a great big road trip from Merthyr Tydfil to Manchester. I turn around to the camera and I go, this doesn't feel certain at all to me. This feels like they're in with a serious shout. We went to America and used the same methods in Indiana and Baltimore, and came back and said, you know, I think Donald Trump's in with a serious shout here, when that was sort of heretical. And it's not rocket science, you know, that's just what happens when you talk to people. So that's one aspect of it. And also what we found was that people who were supporting Brexit and voting for Donald Trump, some of them fit the sort of demonology that people with our sort of politics might apply to those people. But a lot of them, if not most of them, don't, right? And, you know, you empathize and sympathize with a lot of what people say, and you understand where those things come from. So that's one aspect of it. And then the other one, which has really started to cohere in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, is the imperative not to go to places and say, isn't it terrible here? And that's it. I think there was a time when saying, isn't it terrible here? And it's full of boarded up shops and the opportunities are very thin on the ground. That was a necessary thing because people were not aware of those things. But that eventually began to stick in people's craw. If you go to Stoke-on-Trent, as the media did around the Stoke-on-Trent by-election 4 or 5 years ago, and say, this looks like Detroit and it's a moonscape, people get pissed off, right? So then we felt we got to change this. And John went off on his own and made a series called Made in Stoke-on-Trent, which is about all the people trying to change Stoke-on-Trent. And that marked a complete change, really, in what we did. So that everywhere we went, and this is still the case, you don't leave town till you've found somebody doing something interesting and positive that points towards a different outcome for the place that you're reporting from.
Which is very Compass 45 degrees, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's probably nicked from conversations I'd had with you, I think.
Yeah, find the emerging energy, because it is everywhere. You've only got to look under any rock in any place, and you see active, engaged, thoughtful, caring, compassionate, inventive, creative citizens, don't you, doing stuff, you know?
Yeah. The telling thing is most of them either have or want no part of party politics.
Yeah, because it just feels...
And that became part of the story. I mean, there's a sequence in a film we made just before Christmas around the election in Grimsby, where we go to this amazing social project on an estate in Grimsby. And it's mostly women, because it is usually women who take the lead in these things. And they're doing all this amazing stuff. And we go around to them saying, how do you feel about the election? And most of them, not all of them, but most of them are indifferent to it. And it's not a blank indifference. They're like, well, it's not relevant, right? What I'm doing here is ensure people, right? Or we've got allotments out the back, and that's what I'm doing here. And what's pouring out on my television every night doesn't really seem to fit with that. Now, you can argue about whether that's a misapprehension.
Yeah. But the question then is, to make all of that bottom-up, creative, energetic stuff, is the politics has to make that coherent and strategic. That's the question, isn't it? So you have to have both sides of the 45-degree thing. How do we change the state to help make that stuff sustainable, systemic, strategic? That's the question. Has to be, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you see evidence of that, right? So when you see good city or local government, or even better, sort of hyper-local government at the town or parish level, you do sort of get a sense of how the state might join up, or not join up, facilitate, enable, enhance a lot of this stuff. But often that stuff's very, very thin on the ground. And that's just because local government has been downgraded down the years. It doesn't seem to be your first port of call if you want to change things. But I feel sort of optimistic that some of that will start to change, as much as anything, because it's happened where I live, you see. Frome in Somerset is the cradle of this thing, flat pack democracy, where we've got a very activist town council. None of the councillors have anything or very few of them have anything to do with party politics. And it's really made a difference in the town. 50% of the town is quite disadvantaged. The average income here is relatively low. There are real social problems here, but the town council is very involved in, we have a publicly funded food bank. Our town hall is full of social enterprises that are allowed in on very reduced rates. Also, there's lots of initiatives about sustainability happening because of that town council. And I've seen that happen in places that you wouldn't. We have a bit of a reputation here, thanks to the Sunday Times. Everyone here plays the trombone and keeps bees and drinks funny lager. Speaking as someone who drinks funny lager and plays the trombone, last autumn I went to Milton Keynes and there's a community council, which is like a parish council in Milton Keynes. Now, that is not an area where people have beards down to their knees and wear lederhosen and keep bees and all the rest of it, right? And they were doing exactly what that is happening in Frome, but they just done it instinctively. No one had given them that. There is a manual called Flat Pack Democracy. No one had given the manual. They were just getting on with it. And there's lots of examples of that. So I just think you have to look beyond the usual charm circles. And thus far, there's very little sign of any sort of coherent and enduring and meaningful awareness of what I'm talking about at the national level.
Well, let's make it so. Look, final question from me before we open it out. And there's quite a few questions lining up, I think, including one about, will you now play your trombone? We first met around the 2005 general election when you were writing a book called
Banjo.
The Banjo. Fantastic. You've written a book called So Now Who Do We Vote For? Which is a kind of quest for a political outlet after the kind of, the rocky late years of New Labour, the difficult second album. So you said earlier about how complicated this is, and it won't necessarily pan out as a left-wing progressive collectivist thing. Let's see, what your early thoughts on the biggest shock to our political system we've probably ever seen in our lifetime. How do you see the ruins starting to shape up in terms of what's happening, or is it just going to be bloody complicated?
I'm not sure how to answer that question, but I think here and elsewhere, there are signs of things which it'll be quite hard to deny, and which might prove to be sort of propitious for our sort of politics, in the sense that, as happens in war, although I think most martial metaphors are completely misplaced, right? So in war, everyone gets a job, everyone who can work works, women in the factories and all that stuff, Whereas this is quite an odd crisis because it's marked by inactivity, right? It's marked by the forced laying off of people and this new word furloughing and all that. And that makes it even more complicated. But I think in the way that we are realizing that and all these things are cliches already, people who get paid £8.50 an hour are the most essential people for keeping society ticking over. And Mike Ashley and Richard Branson and Tim Martin, who owns Wetherspoons, aren't. That's, as a piece of symbolism, I think is really quite something. And I'm interested in what that already has probably let loose. I think that the veneration of care workers and NHS workers, and that's not in any particular order. I just think that the NHS, as Nigel Lawson said, quite rightly, was already England's national religion, right? And I'm not knocking that. That's a good thing. But again, care workers with this great invisible sector of society. I know where I live, right? I see them, and they're mostly women at the school gates, and they have uniforms on that aren't NHS, and we all know they're care workers, but I got the sense that not many people knew what they did, apart from the people who knew them, right? And certainly if you're from a middle-class background like me, that wasn't something you inquired into, and suddenly those people are front and center, and we've all heard their stories, right? So I think all of those things are very, very important. I think there's a sense within this moment as well that the distant state isn't delivering, and part of the reason for its ineptitude, part of it's down to the fact that at the moment, the distant state is run by entitled people who seem to take this very casual approach to very important things, right? I think that's probably true of the Prime Minister. But at the same time, even if it was a different crew of people in charge who had better intentions and took it more seriously, in the state's distance from our lives lies some of the problems that we've encountered. So I think all those, perhaps some of those things and other things might point in a better direction. And I think it's almost certain that they'll be part of the conversation, and to some extent they already are. But I think there are other things sitting in this moment that are much more awkward, like the fact that a lot of people see a pandemic as something that comes in from elsewhere, right, into your country, and that's a narrative which it doesn't take much stoking to make almost ubiquitous. That's why Donald Trump clearly is talking about the Chinese virus, and now he announced overnight, didn't he, that he wants to ban all immigration into the US, and people like Orban in Hungary are very keen on that same narrative, as is Marine Le Pen, I think. So there are difficult parts of this at the same time. The other one is, don't underestimate, not all peoples, but there'll be a significant number of people who are quite relieved at even the semblance of a return to normality and don't want to talk about change, are like, can't it just be like it was before? And so for our side to come around the corner and say, no, we're going to have even more disruption and revolution and so on, even if it's the right thing to do, that'll be a difficult conversation to manage in some respects. So I think it's complicated. But the other thing, because we're British, you see, part of the thing that gets us through is something that I'm not very keen on. I don't like the fact everyone goes gaga about the royal family in the midst of these things, right? I find that really difficult. But that's sort of part of what gets some people through. And you have to respect that, right? That there's a measure of sort of deference and of nostalgia which keeps people going. I'm probably guilty of that myself. I've already mentioned 1945 about 6 times, which is probably a completely misplaced analogy. So that sort of cuts across progressive kind of intentions, doesn't it? When I read that guy Ben Fogle saying, let's all stand on our doorsteps next Tuesday and clap for the Queen, I was like, oh God. But at the same time, if that's what people want to do, and it makes them, it kind of gets them through the horror, you'd be pretty arrogant to say, get back in your house, It's difficult. But broadly speaking, I think there probably is a progressive way out of this if we all work hard enough. Otherwise, I wouldn't be having this conversation.
Yeah. We have got to work hard to make it happen. Right, Grace.
Really, really hard.
Yeah. Grace, let's hit the phones. Go on, pick some people out to ask John questions. Make them really difficult.
Okay, I was actually going to start with a nice easy one, because 2 different people asked it as well. But Barbara Clark, if you're there, would you want to ask the question that you asked right at the beginning of the conversation?
Yes, it was in the context of the lockdown. How do you access these people? How do you find them, the ones you're talking to?
Great question. Mixture of things, really. So we deal with organizations. So sometimes they're very hyper-local organizations, like this new sort of crop of mutual aid groups that have sprung up. Sometimes we just Google a place name, and then maybe the local paper has spoke to people. So there's a lot of the next film is about Tredegar in South Wales, because I Googled it and found in the South Wales Echo a report about a Labour town councillor who was doing work there. So we got hold of him. Sometimes, and this happens reasonably often, we're going through charities and NGOs. So the next film is partly about people with so-called underlying conditions. And we were put in touch with a lot of those by, groups like the British Lung Foundation, or there's an arthritis charity we've been working with. So that's been very productive. Then other times you just find people on Facebook. I got a load of a load of text messages that were examples of the text messages they send to people who are having to shield, vulnerable people who have to stay in their homes for 12 weeks. And the government has sent them loads and loads of text messages, some of which say things like, have you thought about learning Sudoku? I'm not making this up. And I got a job lot of those messages because someone was on Twitter saying, have you seen these messages? So I said, right, brilliant. Can you follow me and I'll direct message you? And then you end up having a phone conversation with them. You couldn't do it without the internet, but there's so many different ways of doing it. It's proved to be okay. It works really, really well. And it's not that self-selecting. The range of people that I've been speaking to, as I said earlier, has been very, very wide. So I hope that's the proof of the fact that it works.
Go on, Grace. More questions?
Right. So next up, Sheila. We don't have a surname, just Sheila. If you can hear us, Sheila, could you ask your question?
Great. Oh, thank you very much. I think you kind of sort of started to answer this, John, earlier when you talked about flat pack democracy, or whatever you call it, and coming to Milton Keynes, which is actually where I live. I wondered if you'd noticed many differences between communities. Are some more resilient than others are to these stresses and strains? And if so, why do you think they're more resilient?
I can't answer that in the sense that I get from the sort of all the different places and people that we've spoken to in the last 3 or 4 weeks, my impression is that community self-organization and the resilience in quote marks that it brings, which obviously has its limits. I got the sense today, speaking to people in Birmingham, that it was amazing what they were doing, but I didn't want to use a term like resilience because they've really been hit hard by it. And it's had a huge effect on them. And I think resilience might be a misplaced word in that sense, but it's sort of universal. It's happening everywhere. And I don't have any hard and fast answers about whether it's stronger in certain places than others. One thing I did notice in my own town early on was how amazingly the town council turned around almost its entire operation to this crisis, even though that's not formally its remit. So according to the letter of the law, as I understand it, your town council is there to run your park. It has an advisory role on planning, and there's sort of 2 or 3 other things it does if it wants to sort of take a minimalist view of it. But our town council is effectively the absolute sort of hub, the center of all the COVID-19 crisis help, which is going on beyond the main national public services. And there were all these banners went up around town. This is like a month ago saying, check in on your 5 nearest neighbours. And they were really making sure the food bank was as well resourced as it possibly could be. And we've got people, volunteer bike couriers picking up people's prescription. This isn't any part of any official scheme. They just went to the local health centre, whether it's a pharmacy, and said, what can we do to help? And they said, well, you can deliver people prescriptions. So all that's going on. And it's been remarkable. And that's because we had that capacity here already. But as you said a moment ago, you mentioned Milton Keynes. I think that's happening in a hell of a lot of places. Because there's hardly anywhere in Britain that hasn't got pre-existing social capacity, both within the Orthodox state at the most local level and outside it as well. And that's why this is happening. And it's amazing. That side of it is absolutely incredible. It just, I'm sort of awed by it, really. Because I wouldn't know where to start. Can you imagine? I mean, places as well that have started from a standing start and just said, right, what the hell are we going to do? I spoke to someone in Plymouth yesterday who, up till about a year ago, ran a neighbourhood watch scheme. And they said, well, with all this capacity and all these people, surely we can do more than checking for signs of crime. And that's now essentially a sort of community organisation that comes close to running this area of Plymouth, and is centrally involved in COVID-19 relief. So there's amazing things going on. But I don't think you can differentiate. I think it's happening everywhere.
I mean, it's just amazing how quickly civil society communities can act compared to the state, isn't it? Yeah. The state would have to go through bureaucratic processes. And then
to do with the other thing is it's to do with the internet. Let's not underestimate that. Yeah. So and again, you see, another way this is complicated is I went into this and I'd still write them tomorrow. I still believe it, writing about how the fact that Facebook and Google were too powerful. They have monopolistic structures. There was a mismatch between power and responsibility, that they were behaving in very, very malign ways and having all sorts of malign effects on politics and democracy and society. Now, I still think all that, right? But having said that, it's complicated. And I think I'm right in saying that 95% of these new mutual aid groups conduct their operations via Facebook, right? So if it hadn't been for those people in Northern California, arguably, it would be a lot harder.
Next question.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So on that topic, we just had a question from Martin about mutual aid as a political movement.
Oh, this is far-fetched, but is there any sense in which mutual aid could be an embryonic political movement? Or what would it take for mutual aid to be an embryonic political movement?
Well, the phrase, correct me if I'm wrong, is taken from Kropotkin. So it has a political pedigree. Mutual aid, as I understand it, in the non-Johnny Rotten way, is an anarchist concept. So in other words, anarchism is the most sort of, hyper-local, non-statist, but essentially collectivist model of organization. So it's a political act to some degree. The answer is you have to wait and see. And the last thing those people want, I would imagine, is anyone turning up saying, well, how do you make this political? Because they're just getting on with it. And I think we have to accept that. In the fullness of time, it may be the case that it takes on a more political nature. We just don't know yet. So people are changed by doing it, maybe, and I think once you become sort of active where you live, and once you begin to understand that what you're presented with isn't a given and it can be changed in all sorts of ways, that probably has a profound effect politically on lots of people. We just don't know where it's going yet. I'm just wary of, and I know this isn't what you're suggesting at all. Do you remember? I mean, the Labour Party has these fits of enthusiasm about community organising. They never really seem to go anywhere. And that's because there is this mismatch between it. If you latch onto these things and in the end, and then you say, and can we use all your people, please, to do knocking up at the election and take people to the polling station? It's such an awkward fit. People sort of recoil. But I think it will have political effects. I just think we don't know what they are yet. And I think it's reasonably certain they'll lean in a way which is favourable to our politics. But you have to leave that to happen organically, to sound like Rosa Luxemburg rather than Lenin.
Actually, someone else was asking about the role of sort of civil society in influencing the Labour Party. So you kind of answered that question a little bit as well already.
Yeah.
The next one.
I mean, right now, the other thing is, right now, you know, I mean, it's good that the Labour Party's there. It's always good that the Labour Party's there, right? Fulfilling the role of an opposition and all the rest of it. But you know, the whys and wherefores of party politics are not really on my radar at the moment. In the fullness of time, they might be, but they're not sort of right now.
Yeah.
Seems sort of unseemly, really, to think about that stuff.
Yeah.
That's just an.
All right. Next up, David Edgar. David, can you hear us? He had a question about the protests that we've seen in America.
Yes, John. I just wondered. I mean, is there any sense of American-style stop the lockdown protests, which seem to be a kind of individualistic right-wing libertarian thing, which is quite sort of foreign to our shores, and just connected with that, you said at the top that authorities having a bad war so far, and I think probably over the last week or 10 days that's true. I must say, up until then, I was sort of quite impressed by the way that, you know, we weren't hearing about expert cosmopolitan elitists, you know, as Tory ministers and prime ministers were standing between experts every tea time, telling us what they thought. So I just wonder, with that kind of model that affected the election so much of you know, populist small town communities versus international globalist elites, how you felt that binary had weathered during the crisis so far, and indeed whether or not that sort of right-wing libertarian get us back to work, live free or die feel is going, if there's any of that.
I'm laughing because I'm thinking, well, there'll be 20 people next year who write doctoral theses about that, because it's a very relevant but enormous question. It seems to me that one of the reasons this is happening in the States is because there are things within the sort of political and social culture of the States which are quite specific to the States about the resistance of authority. Although actually a lot of these things are focused on state government, I think a certain animosity towards the federal government is sort of in there somewhere. This idea that the feds are always trying to take your freedom away somehow. And so the symbolism of those people turning up with guns, it sort of blurs into the right to bear arms and all that. And we don't have those things here so much. You know, the idea that it's your inalienable right to do what the hell you want, which has sort of noble aspects, but it has very unfortunate aspects as well, I think is much more ingrained in the US, certainly the white population of the US, than it is here. I think it takes on a more sort of colloquial, apolitical form here, because it's not like I haven't heard people in shop queues and so on over the last month say, I think this is all made up, you know. Or what did someone say? It's not a pandemic, it's a plandemic. I read someone had said that the other day. But I think the gravity of it is just obvious to 99% of people. And one of the reassuring things, I think, is that people have managed to mix, or some people anyway, have managed to mix sort of doing what they're told and following the rules of the lockdown with also this drive to sort of get involved somehow and help people as much as they can. Which is really, really great. But I don't think that any of those things have necessarily gone away. If you can, you should watch on the Financial Times' website. There's a video of their interview with President Macron, which is not someone I'm a massive fan of, or wasn't up to this point. But he says that this is a very dangerous sort of juncture, really, in terms of that sort of contest, if you like, between populism and more sort of liberal internationalist ways of looking at things. Because he says that the narrative which is waiting to come out the box might turn out to be these people, in other words, the supposed elites, right? They didn't help us after the crash of 2008. They didn't come to our rescue then. And if national governments, and I think this runs a bit wider than Britain and America, you know, anywhere significant numbers of people have died, it strikes me that potentially that's awaiting a narrative of, look, those people in Paris and Madrid and wherever, they didn't come and help us with this either. Look at how many of us died, right? And he says that's a real danger. And it's a danger not just for mainstream politics in quote marks in those countries. It's a danger for the European Union, which he talks about very vividly in that interview. And I think that's real. So I don't think any of this has gone away. For the moment, it seems to me it's in abeyance in this country, but that doesn't mean it's not latent and it won't come back. And I think that applies to a lot of continental Europe, and America in that sense is sort of ahead of the curve because it's already exploded for sort of culturally specific reasons. I hope that sort of starts to answer the question.
Brilliant. We've just put the Macron link up on the chat thing, and it's really worth a look at that because it's a fantastic interview. Maybe just one more, I think, Grace, before we kind of begin to wind up.
All right, one more question.
No, really, I mean, it's just a clever person thinking aloud, thinking, what does this mean, right? And it doesn't matter if you don't like his politics. I don't really, but it's amazing to see, and it just is very thought-provoking, and it's about 20 minutes long. Everyone should watch.
And the bit for me was how kind of sort of humble he was and kind of vulnerable. He said, I don't know a lot, didn't he? I don't know the answer to that, you know, and then gave some thought.
He said, this changes everything. He says, this changes everything, most of all for people like me. I think he says something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's powerful stuff.
And he talks about climate change and says, you know, do you really think, I mean, think of the symbolism here, right? See, this disease manifests itself as suffocation. That's what he says, right? And what do you think that this begins to recede? However that happens, we don't know that yet. And then people walk out and put up with terrible air quality again, and the fact they suffocate in a different way, right? All of these things are relevant to the moment. And the great thing about that interview is as we've been trying to, he talks about the potentially malign and the potentially positive aspects of it very candidly.
That leads really neatly into Chris Neal's question, if you're there, Chris.
Yeah, so the question is, John, do you think that the people you're talking to through your Anywhere But Westminster work, do you think that those people are convinced by the idea that as we emerge from this crisis, we should try and change things and build a good society? Or are they just desperate to get back to business as usual?
Well, I haven't asked that many people that question. Most of what I've been asking them is just about their direct experience, but there are things sort of implied in what they've said, and some people have talked very directly about it. So a good example is a woman we spoke to who lives in Leeds, who she is a TA in a primary school who teaches special needs kids, and her husband is in the Philippines, and because of the visa rule that says that if you earn less than £18,600, you can't bring your spouse into the country. She and her son, who's autistic, have to live apart from his father and her husband. And there's a bit in the film where she says, I really want to think that we'll come out of this and I'll be newly acknowledged as a key worker, and people will understand how awful and unequal it is that I can't live with my husband. But she says, I think she says or implies that she's not feeling that optimistic. So the idea, at least potentially, of a shift in the conversation and a shift in the sort of the state's view of, say, people in low paid work, I think that kind of is in people's minds. I think young people, I don't think that idea of somehow there have to be reparations to the young and things have to change, I don't think that's made up. I think that was very powerful anyway because of Brexit, and I think that's probably gone up a notch. So I think that's kind of out there as well. But it won't acquire momentum, and it won't cohere into something clear, I don't think, unless it finds its way into politics. And one of the striking things about the Macron interview, and again, it's complicated because I'm not sure he's the politician who's going to deliver this, but he at least wants to understand the meaning of this and talk about the politics of it and so on, is when you watch it, you think, I can't imagine a British politician on right or left, or an English politician anyway, talking in these terms, you know. And the problem with our politics recurrently is that, you know, because we're English, we tend to always go back to this sort of phlegmatic, what works, change a bit here, change a bit there, tinker around, it'll be okay, muddle through sort of vocabulary. And I think that's still there. So it's all kind of uncertain. But I do think that there'll be some sense In the same way, there was some sense, you know, coming out of the referendum, even though it was based somewhat in a contradictory way on the fact all those people who voted to leave the European Union, there was some sense of what we've seen there is an expression of the fact that people have had enough. I think there's a reasonable likelihood that something similar will apply to this. And enough of it will apply in a potentially progressive sense to mean there's a political opportunity. But as I keep saying, a lot of it won't be like that. And so it'll also be about resisting things as well as positively making the case for other things.
So let's wrap this up now. I mean, I think, you know, one of the dangers...
You ask me another couple of questions, you can. I'm enjoying this.
I don't mind. Is there any other burning ones, Grace, that are there? So see if there are.
There were a few people. I don't know if this is really something you can answer, John, but maybe really quickly, there are a few people asking what can we do stuck at home right now?
Recently?
We can't go out and organise in person, but what could we be doing from our desks, if anything?
I think there are loads of things you can do. If you're fortunate enough to be sort of furloughed, or you're working from home in quote marks, and you have a little bit more time than you used to, and I know that doesn't apply to millions and millions and millions of people. If you have got that opportunity, I am finding personally that there are all sorts of sort of networks I'm now part of, and people that I'm talking to, just because I've got like even an extra half hour a day to sort of dig around on Facebook and Twitter and see who's around and read things and all the rest of it. And I am sort of getting a greater sense of what's out there and who's doing what and how me and the people I know might fit in with it. I think this is a really good example of that. The very fact that Compass exists and is sort of providing this space for people to talk and think is really, really important. But they're quite sort of innocuous things, like just, you know, at the moment I'm reading a really good book. I can't remember the title of. I'll mail it, Neil, so it can go on a website. About it came out in 2017 about pandemics. I'm also reading a history from the perspective of San Francisco about AIDS in the 80s, written in 1987, which is partly about the politics of AIDS in Reagan's America and all that, which has all the parallels with now are very indirect and not clear at all, but it seems to be something that you can sort of bear in mind as you're thinking about all this. Loads of things, you know. I'm reading, you know, and again, all these martial metaphors and analogies of the Second World War are all wrong, but I seem to be reading a lot about that. You know, just fill your head with as much as you can that makes you think big thoughts about society and history and where we might be going, at the same time as you sort of extend your networks and insert yourself in as many conversations as you can. Because although the world is quiet, the world as viewed via your phone or your computer or your tablet doesn't seem to be like that at all. It seems to me that almost because people aren't having any or many direct interchanges with people, there's conversations happening elsewhere in a much more powerful and sort of collective way than it probably was 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, and I
can't think of anything else.
And I get that sense as well of greater connectedness, of being part of a giant spider web that's kind of tingling in a way that I haven't felt.
The other thing is most people are being nice. Most people are being nice to each other. I mean, that's most people in my orbit. I don't think that's true across the piece, but most people I deal with at the moment are being nice to each other, right? And so, and let's be honest, you know, the world in which any of us who were interested in politics were moving up until 2 or 3 weeks ago was pretty rancorous and horrible, right? We've just seen another dose of it with this Labour Party report, you know, which seems to have reawakened all the faction fighting and all that. It seems to me to be sort of surplus to requirements at the moment, whatever the rights and wrongs of it. But by and large, I'm just finding that I think when you're confronted with awfulness and horror and catastrophe, inevitably people do start being nicer to each other. And that's a much more fertile ground on which you begin to have conversations, particularly if your politics is all about reaching out and being pluralistic and talking to the other side. The atmosphere is a bit more conducive to all that at the moment, and that's a nice thing, you know.
It is a nice
within
thing.
limits, you know. I'm not being nice to Nigel Farage all of a sudden, but then he's not being very nice to anyone else. So,
but maybe the pool of people that we can be nice to and with and for is growing, so that's a good thing. So, just very finally, John, you know, and you touch upon this, but just reiterate some of the points. You know, where do you get out of bed and you do your reports? You know, what is hopeful? Where do you find inspiration and hope to keep going and keep writing and keep believing?
Well, I sort of, God, what a question. Well, I see hope in the fact that in very different ways, comparable things, you know, the small and great leaps forward have happened down the years, you know, and not just 1945, you know, my family on my father's side are all from the South Wales valleys, you know, and it's often misunderstood in our industrial history that the welfare state and that great sort of collectivist leap forward of 1945 took root as people organised themselves and their communities spontaneously, you know, miners' welfares, friendly societies, trade unionism, crucially. So, you know, something similar to this great sort of sprouting of grassroots organisation and collective awareness of who we are as a society, that's happened in the past, right? And it's led on to these political changes once in the 20th century. I mean, arguably similar things in a limited fashion happened in the early 20th century in response to what happened in the 19th, right? Pensions and the birth of the welfare state in Lloyd George's time. So these things have happened. There's a lot of inspiration one can take from history, right? But then the other thing is, we live in a time of decline, not declinist narratives, these catastrophic narratives, and in the midst of this, it's very hard not to think, well, that must be real. You know, the world's getting worse, right? It's a very persuasive and pervasive idea that the world's getting worse. Well, like, you know, as a matter of instinct, I still believe that technology can liberate us. You know, I'm of a generation that began with microcomputers in the early 80s. You know. And we thought that then. And then, you know, 13 years after that, in 1995, the internet came along with those meteors falling on the Netscape logo. And then we had Web 2.0 and social media. And whenever I meet, there's two sets of people who really inspire me, right? There's the ones who are doing all this amazing community organizing and all these very grassroots initiatives that I meet whenever I'm reporting. The other people I meet who always amaze me are sort of techie people who work within to some extent, but also outside big tech, right? So I'm in the habit now of going to this big tech event in Berlin every year where all these European tech people are there. And they're doing things like making a sat-nav system that fits in a pair of glasses so visually impaired people can find their way around cities using the same technology as sat-navs. That was one of the most inspiring ones I met in Berlin. And all of it is tilted in an empowering, progressive direction. Because it seems to me that for all the monopolistic tendencies of big tech, that's sort of inherent in the technology itself. It gives people voice, it gives people influence, and it enables people to do things that without that technology they couldn't. And what's happening in this crisis is an example of it. So I'm not a tech utopian, right? But I still sort of believe all this puts us in an immeasurably promising position to change things for the better. And it wasn't like that in the 80s when I was in my teens, you know. It did feel dreadful because you didn't really feel like you had the tools. And Thatcher and her crew did have all the equipment. I think the power relations of the world now are tilted in a much more equal, empowering direction. And, you know, for those two reasons, you know, the person in Milton Keynes organising the recycling food project that keeps people fed, plus the person in Berlin making the sat-nav system for visually impaired people. And between the two of those lies the answer.
Good. And we've long said that kind of flattening process does lend itself to a good society, but there's no virus determinism, there's no tech determinism. We've got to work for it, and that's what Compass is about. Thanks, John. You've been brilliant. We'll have you on the banjo next time. Fantastic contribution. Thanks, everyone, for asking all those. No, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you as well. A great question.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. Thanks everyone for asking them, for posing them, and for being here tonight and making it possible, and being Compass members and making it possible. For those who are listening on the podcast, if you like what you've heard and you want to be part of this much more equal, democratic and sustainable future, this good society, then go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast and join up. You can tweet me whenever you want to at Neil_Compass, or you can tweet Compass at Compass Office, or one word. And if you've enjoyed the podcast, if you're listening to it, then give us a rating so more people can hear about it and they can know as well as you do that it's bloody complicated. So thanks again, Grace. Thanks again, John. Next week we'll be joined by author, thinker and public service designer Hilary Cotton to discuss her work on radical help. And until then, everyone, keep safe and keep well. Take care and good night.